I'm Sari.
And I'm Haley.
And this is Seamwork Radio. Welcome, Caroline and Helen. We're so happy to have you on today. How are you guys doing?
Thank you. We're good. I'm good.
I'm good too. Thank you so much for having us.
We're so happy you're here. We thought that since it's kind of nearing the end of the year right now, we'd just kind of take a look back at the podcast world in the last year, and we could all share some favorites from the last year, since I know a lot of us like to listen to podcasts while we sew. I love listening to podcasts while I sew, amongst other things. So yeah, I wanted to start by just kind of talking about you guys and how did you start your podcast? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's a pretty cute story because Caroline had sent me a text asking if I wanted to start a podcast. And I replied in all caps, yes, because we had just been chatting about how there aren't enough sewing podcasts. Like, we cannot get enough of the sewing podcast content, especially when you are sewing. You want to be listening to sewing stuff. So It was just a really exciting idea when she messaged me. And that was early days of my business, Helen's Closet and Blackbird Fabrics. So it was a really fun way for us to connect and get to interview people in our industry, and just a really exciting way for us to engage with the sewing community.
Yeah.
At the time when I texted Helen, I was cutting a whole bunch of denim. Like, I was spending days and days just cutting denim and listening to podcasts, and there just wasn't a sewing podcast out there at the time that I loved that was like consistently releasing episodes. So that was kind of the motivation, as I was just like in the depths of cutting fabric. And I was like, I need more things to listen to. We need to make this happen.
Do you guys listen to like a lot of other podcasts besides sewing stuff, or is it like primarily crafting that you're all about?
Oh, no, I love all different types of podcasts, business podcasts, big true crime fan, love like history and I don't know, like This American Lifestyle podcast, whatever you call those ones. I like them all.
Yeah, same here. I listen to podcasts on my commute into work and when I'm like cooking and cleaning. So a lot of podcasts in my feed for sure.
I'm kind of curious, do you guys have like a favorite episode of your own podcast?
Ooh, that's a big question. It's so hard to pick a favorite. I feel like we've done this before and then it kind of changes.
Uh-huh.
How about a favorite from this last season?
Yeah, what's your favorite, Helen, from the last season?
I mean, on a personal side, I really enjoyed our interview with Bhairavi from Strawberry Creek Quilts, because I have recently gotten into quilting and it was so fun just to get to ask her all of my beginner quilting questions.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite ones from this past season is our fabric stash organization episode, because we like talked all about the different ways you can organize your stash, and it really inspired me to like get back into my sewing room and organize my stuff too. So a lot of the time our podcast is like an inspiration for me as well.
I feel the same way.
That's something I really need to listen to again. We both agree.
Yeah, definitely. A lot of times we'll like plan episodes and get talking on a certain subject. And I'm like, man, I really got to get some like wardrobe planning going, or like whatever the like, topic du jour is for that particular episode. I'm just inspiring myself a lot. Really.
Likewise. Yeah.
This kind of like leads us, I guess, into the topic of this episode, which is that we're going to just share like a lot of our favorites with you all today. I think that we're going to kick it off, keeping it all about sewing, and talk about our favorite sewing podcasts, or a particular podcast episode if we have one. Caroline, do you have a favorite sewing podcast?
I do. I picked my favorite as the Sew and Tell podcast. So this one is hosted by 3 sewists. They're each from fashion, like indie sewing and theater backgrounds. Mm-hmm. So it's hosted by Meg Healy, Amanda Crestio, and Kate Zeinard. And they discuss sewing topics. They share their creative knowledge. They talk about the latest trends in sewing and fashion. So I love that. I really love this podcast because it feels like I'm catching up about sewing with friends. Like, it's super casual and fun, chatty. I find them super relatable. And my favorite episodes are the ones where they review like fashion trends from the runway, and then they talk about whether or not they're going to incorporate those trends into their sewing. And I just find it so hilarious to hear their opinions about what is trendy in the upcoming fashion like runway season. So yeah, it's a really fun podcast. Highly recommend.
I like that one too. I was going to mention the episode that they did on unpopular sewing opinions recently. This was just the end of September, so it was a pretty recent episode, but I really like that because they really got into this discussion of imperfection and doing things, quote, the right way and the wrong way. And I feel like talking about those kinds of things is really, I don't know, it's really liberating sometimes. So I like that episode a lot.
Yeah, I thought that episode was funny too, because at the end they were sort of like, I guess these aren't really unpopular opinions.
Yeah.
They're just opinions. And like, we sort of agree on them anyway. So it shows like sort of the range of people's preferences in the sewing world. Like, you know, one person will tell you they love one thing, another person will hate it. And that's kind of the beauty of it. There's just such a diverse range of sewing techniques and ways to approach the craft.
Yeah, for sure.
Helen, what about you?
Well, I have recently really been enjoying the Asian Sewist Collective podcast. This is a new podcast. It came out this year, and it's hosted by two sewists in our community, Ada and Nicole. And the Asian Sewist Collective is run by a group of people of Asian descent from all over the world. And in their podcast, they explore the intersection of their identities and their sewing practices. And the podcast is for Asian sewists and their allies. And I know that Seamwork listeners will really enjoy their sewing banter and the insightful discussions and lots of different topics. And they also have excellent audio quality, which I'm always looking for in podcasts, and great guests. Recently, they had Jennifer Weiss from Workroom Social on their pod, and also Leila Kelleher from Muna and Broad. Big fan of both of those people. So it was great to hear from them. And a 2-part series on mindful fabric selection, which I thought was really interesting. So definitely check that out if you haven't yet.
We had a feature in Seamwork magazine with one of the founders of that podcast, and it's just like so cool. I've yet to give them a listen, but I'm like adding it to my list right now. It'll be really helpful when we put the show notes together for this episode, because it'll be like my listening checklist.
Totally.
Who should go next? You want to go next, Haley?
Oh, yeah. Totally. Okay, so I'm gonna like have a fangirl moment, and Love to Sew is definitely my favorite sewing podcast to listen to. And my favorite episode, I just listened to it, and maybe I'm partial, but I loved Tailoring for Them with Amelia. I think it was an amazing episode, and I think what appealed to me about it the most is I just loved like the social aspect and hearing their story. And Amelia's just like a really amazing, interesting person. But then I got to nerd out about tailoring stuff with them. And I was just like, I listened to it when I was like walking to the market, and it was just like so fun and joyful. And it made me want to go sew something tailored and amazing. And I just love everything that Amelia makes. So, like, I don't even know how they are a Seamwork ambassador. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't even believe someone this cool wants to, like, associate with us.
They are so cool, and they know so much about tailoring. Like, they were dropping words in that episode that I had never heard in my life. Mm-hmm. I consider myself to be a pretty advanced sewist, but they were schooling us for sure.
You guys did a great job of like kind of like backing it up and like extracting some knowledge and having them break it down for you. And it was just like so amazing. I felt like, I mean, I'm like a nerd with that stuff, but I felt like even someone who's like never made like a tailored jacket or blazer would like just die listening to that. So good.
Thank you. Well, you know, it was in part inspired because of the series that they wrote on Teamwork. So it's a love fest over here today.
Oh, yay. I love it. I'm like, oh gosh, I feel like I'm gonna, when I was thinking about what I was gonna talk about in this episode, I'm like, I'm gonna like, maybe I'm gonna embarrass them. Oh well. Oh, well, I'm not too proud to gush.
Every podcast needs a lot of love because it's a lot of work put into a podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but sometimes, like, I mean, obviously I know people listen to it, like I interact with like our listeners, but then it's still surprising sometimes you get like tagged in a bunch of stories or something and you're like, oh wow, it's not just like an echo chamber, it's real. It feels so like singular when you're doing it. Like I'm like, yeah, it's just Sari and I chatting, but it's not just that. All right, Sari, we got to know your favorite sewing podcast.
Well, I want to talk about a specific episode, I think, of the Stitch Please podcast, which I think is an awesome sewing podcast. I think it's amazing. She celebrates Black voices in sewing, which is also an amazing purpose and mission behind her podcast. But I really enjoyed her episode interviewing Rashida Coleman Hale because I love Rashida's work as a designer, and I just love Lisa, the host. Her energy and her sense of humor are just so wonderful, and it's so fun to listen to. And the episode just really made me laugh out loud. I loved it. And, I went back to look at some of the episodes as I was thinking about which episode I wanted to mention and listen to a few of them again. And I was thinking, like, it's so interesting because she's so extroverted and she's just like so really puts herself out there and has such a bright personality. And I feel like my personality is I'm much more of like thoughtful, introverted type of person. And sometimes I think people think like you have to be that way in order to have a podcast, or you have to, you have to be this like really a performer. I think it's really interesting to listen to these podcasts and hear all the different types of people and all of their different personalities and how it can work in so many different ways. But anyway, I just love her energy. I think she's amazing.
Have to add that one to my list.
So the next category of podcasts we wanted to talk about this one's a little bit more broad, but we wanted to talk about any podcasts that you like that are just on creativity or other crafts or on small business, since you guys are both business owners. So Helen, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, we love talking about small business. We go on a lot of small business tangents on Love to Sew because it is a huge part of both of our lives. And we have a lot of listeners too that are interested in small business or have little side hustles and things like that. So in keeping with our sewing theme, I wanted to mention the Craft Industry Alliance podcast, which is hosted by Abby Glassenberg, legend. And it's such a great resource for anyone working in the textile arts and crafts industry because you get to hear how fellow entrepreneurs started and continue to run their successful businesses and listen to chats about sewing and crafting at the same time. And there's lots of great information in each episode. And there's over 200 episodes to listen to. So there's tons there. And I think even if you're not a business owner or interested in business at all, you'll enjoy this podcast because you get to know some of the designers behind your favorite sewing pattern companies or textile designers behind your favorite fabric companies. So it's really, really cool to listen to their stories.
Yeah, we had Abby on the podcast, I don't know, a couple months ago too. There's an episode if anybody wants to go back and listen to that. She's amazing. She does amazing work. What about you, Carolyn?
So mine is a little bit more small business focused, and it's Dare to Lead. And this one's available on Spotify specifically. So it's hosted by one of my favorite people / authors, Brene Brown. If anyone doesn't know about her, she's a research professor who does a lot of work around courage and vulnerability and shame and empathy. And she's just so great. I love her energy. I love listening to her audiobooks. And this podcast is actually based on her book by the same name. And it's sort of a mix of like solo episodes just with Brene and conversations with individuals that she calls change catalysts, culture shifters, and troublemakers. And they talk about how daring leadership can lead to innovating and creating and building a better, kind of more just world. So I just really love this podcast, mostly because I love everything Brene does, but it's really thoughtful and thought-provoking and inspiring. And it really gets me fired up about my own small business and my own leadership journey. So just love that one.
I love Brene Brown. She's amazing.
Right? She really is.
Yeah, her TED Talk on vulnerability is just incredible. If anybody hasn't watched that, you can find that on YouTube. It's really awesome.
Yeah.
So I'll share mine next. Mine is a podcast called Hurry Slowly with Jocelyn Glei. And this podcast, it's sort of about work. It's sort of about creativity. It's mostly about how you can work at a slower pace and sort of break this chain of productivity that I think a lot of us are burdened with, this idea that you have to be producing all the time and that you need to do more and more and more. And she approaches this from a lot of different angles, which I like. And she's just had some really amazing interviews on the show. The show has slowed down a little bit over the last year, but there have been interviews with people like Jenny Odell, who, if you don't know Jenny Odell, she's an artist and she wrote a book called How to Do Nothing, which is really incredible. People like Debbie Millman. She did an interview with Rob Walker, who I really like. He's a journalist who wrote a book called The Art of Noticing. Also has a great newsletter that I love. But the interviews are wonderful. The people are wonderful. It's just very, very thoughtful, very considered, and always kind of gives me a new perspective on work and on life and how to take things at a more sustainable pace, which is something I'm really interested in, always working on. So that's one. It's called Hurry Slowly by Jocelyn Glei, and we'll put all of these in the show notes. What about you, Haley?
I had to think about this because, like, admittedly, I feel like when I'm listening to podcasts that are outside of like the sewing genre, I mostly listen to like more like true crime or like journalistic type things. I think maybe because my brain is like a little hungry for like a break from thinking about sewing and like small biz stuff all the time. And then I remembered I did listen to something in the last year that was really good and, you know, crafty. It's Lisa Congdon's podcast, which is named the Lisa Congdon Sessions. And she did this really great interview with Jen Hewitt. There's only one season of this podcast so far, and this was the first episode that she did with guest, and Jen and Lisa are friends. They had just like a really like natural conversation, and the topic was about taking like small actions and creating boundaries. And I think that as like creative people, I mean, a lot of people, but I notice in creative people, there's this tendency to like give and kind of like bleed yourself dry for your whatever your craft is. And I'm not really entirely sure what the motivation behind that. Maybe someone, you know, smarter than me would know. But I just think that it was brilliant. And Jen seems really good at creating boundaries, and I want to be that good at it someday when I grow up. And Jen Hewitt, for people listening who may not know, is just this amazing like surface designer, artist, and we'll link to Lisa and her work in the show notes too, so you can go take a peek.
We did an episode with Jen Hewitt, and it was so fun to hear her story. And she's so charismatic, and her work is beautiful. It made me want to block print, and I tried it. And it took a really long time, and I haven't done it again since. But respect.
She's really sweet. She taught a block printing workshop at the place I used to work at in LA, and she was just so nice. And whenever like I meet like cool like creators and artists, I'm always in my head, I have this expectation that like people who are really cool may not be like nice, and that's never really the case. I don't know why.
They didn't get to be popular by not being nice.
I don't know why. I'm always like, I thought the same thing before I met Sari. I was like, oh my gosh, she's, as my friend Christine would say, it's a celebrity. Like, it's like and then I met Sari and she was really nice, and I was like, oh, duh.
Then you learn that I'm a dork that only talks about cats.
And I was like, cool, same. I like it. It's embarrassing to admit, but I'm shameless, so I will admit all the embarrassing things. I don't care.
Well, I'm going to listen to both of those, and I particularly like the sound of the one you mentioned, Sari, because that productivity trap, it's tough. I fall into that all the time, where I find myself like planning out my whole day, thinking I'm going to make the most of every minute, and like, especially when it comes to my sewing projects too, trying to be as productive as possible. And often that doesn't lead to like the satisfaction that you're hoping to find by doing it. And it's fine. You don't need to sew a certain amount or get a certain amount done in a day. You can just relax.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of creative people suffer from, is this impetus to always be creating more and to fill all your time with producing things. It's hard because sewing is a hobby and it's supposed to be something that you do to relax and unwind and do for your own enjoyment. And it definitely is for me, but sometimes it can become like one more productivity trap, one more thing that I can do to make myself useful in my off time, instead of something that I'm doing to enjoy the process and enjoy the moment and enjoy my life. So I'm always looking for things that will remind me to stop and enjoy.
Yes.
And your value is not based solely on your productivity, or really at all. That's very like capitalist type, idea. But that's another podcast episode.
Yes, I have a lot of thoughts on that.
Sewing under capitalism. Ooh, write it down. I see an episode. Well, speaking of other podcasts and other episodes, I think it's time we look at my favorite, not my favorite category. Sewing is probably my favorite category, but the other category. Not sewing, not craft, not art, not biz. Anything else. Miscellaneous. Helen, do you want to kick us off with your fave?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, I'm a big fan of true crime podcasts, and one that I listen to every week and I never hesitate to recommend is Criminal, which you've probably heard of and maybe listened to before. It's been around for ages, but it's hosted by Phoebe Judge, who has one of the best voices in podcasting, I think. Just an amazing storyteller. So it's a podcast with excellent audio editing, intriguing crime tales, and the stories often have a twist at the end, which I always appreciate. And Phoebe interviews the folks involved so that you get like a firsthand account of what happened in a lot of these stories. So I really enjoy that as well. And I find that true crime is such a fun genre, but it can be really intense because obviously the subject matter can be quite heavy. And some of them are really long stories that span like whole seasons, but Criminal is nice because it's a bit more bite-sized. Every episode is like a standalone, unless it's like a two-parter maybe, but mostly it's each week you get one story. And they do tend to be a little less intense, maybe a little less gruesome than some other true crime podcasts that I listen to.
Mm-hmm.
I love Criminal.
Right? Yeah. We all aspire to podcasts like Phoebe.
As like soon as you said that, I just saw Sari nodding. Mm-hmm. I knew. You're speaking her language. We love true crime at like the office. Back when we were like working in person, we'd have lunch together every Friday. And it was like the topic of like conversation always like somehow got back to like true crime somehow, or like something just weird or gross or something.
The dark conversations at lunch.
Yeah.
It's like that TikTok meme where there's like someone like doing dishes with their headphones on and you think they're listening to like a really fun song, and what it really is like someone saying like, he cut up the body and hid it in the trash can. Uh-huh. We used to play true crime podcasts at Blackbird, like just on the floor. We had to stop that. It was like there was just too many people, and then some people were like, "Oh, it's not for me." Not something you want to be blasting to an entire room of people.
And then you're like cutting fabric for orders and like wielding scissors, and you startle someone, and I'm like, "Oh no!"
Yeah.
Then you might be able to start your own true podcast, kind of.
True crime meets sewing.
True crime, yeah.
I feel like there's a niche for that. I don't know.
Oh, it would probably be popular.
Well, there is that one story of that sewing teacher who like, I think she like murdered her husband and then put his body in the trunk and then went and taught a sewing class.
Oh,
what? Oh my gosh. I haven't heard that one.
I need more information.
I'll look it up and send it to you guys. It's a good story. Obviously, the crossover that we all need. Right? Okay, so I want to hear everybody else's favorite other genre podcast or episode. Carolyn, you want to share yours?
Yeah, sure. This was actually hard because I love true crime and like I wanted to pick a true crime one, but the truth is currently my absolute favorite podcast is called Maintenance Phase. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with this one. I've seen it, a lot of people talking about it lately. It's getting a lot of buzz, but it's hosted by Michael Hobbs, who also hosts You're Wrong About, and Aubrey Gordon, who has an Instagram account called Your Fat Friend. And they release episodes every other week. And kind of the premise is that they sort of debunk the junk science behind health and wellness fads, and they decode their cultural meaning. And they have some really fun episodes. Some of my favorites are, well, fun. I mean, they're interesting, thought-provoking, also funny and witty and hilarious. They have an episode about Oprah and The Biggest Loser, which is totally a show I used to watch like in my teenage years and really messed with my head. They have an episode about moon juice. Like there's so many good ones. And obviously there's a lot of like wellness podcasts out there, but this one just really turns everything on its head. And I think it's just such a good podcast. I recommend it to anyone that will listen to me. And anyone who has listened to the podcast has told me that they love it. So I feel really confident saying you should definitely go listen to this podcast if you have not already.
That sounds amazing. There's so much junk out there in the wellness space. There's so much misinformation. Yeah, that sounds amazing.
Also just so much like fat phobia and anti-fat bias. Mm-hmm. And they really dive into that as well, which I think is so important when you're talking about, you know, health and wellness and dieting and all of that stuff. So yeah, really, really such a good pod.
Yeah, for sure.
I recently started listening to that one and I'm really enjoying it. Super good.
It's amazing. It's hard not to listen to many, many episodes at once. And then your whole life just feels like it's Michael and Aubrey, like
yeah.
getting really riled up about stuff. And then you find yourself getting really riled up about stuff. And in the best way. I mean, their relationship is just so great. Their banter, I love it. I love every second of it.
Okay, Sari, your turn.
Well, mine is actually very related to Helen's because the one I chose is This Is Love, which is also by Phoebe Judge. She hosts that as well.
Yeah.
She started that one after Criminal, so there's not as many episodes as there are of Criminal, but it's amazing. It's also a storytelling podcast, so it has a narrative format very similar to Criminal, and she's an amazing host. And the episode that I always tell people to start with, this one came out in April and it's called On the Way to Dinner. And it is an incredible story. It starts with a man finding a baby on the subway platform in New York, like finding an abandoned baby. And the outcome of it is just, you won't believe it. It's amazing. I always tell people to start with that one. And that was in April. So great podcast. I wanted to mention a couple runners up. I listen to a lot of podcasts. Like I heard a statistic just today that the average podcast listener listens to 7 podcasts. And I was like, 7? Only 7? Like I probably follow like 30 podcasts. So I wanted to choose some that were, you know, kind of in different categories. But This Is Love is my first one. I really like the 10% Happier podcast with Dan Harris. Dan Harris is he was a news anchor and he wrote a book called 10% Happier, which is about meditation, but he comes at it from a very kind of skeptical point of view. And he now has 10% Happier is now a company and they have an app with a lot of meditation teachers on it. And he interviews some really interesting people and they're very in-depth conversations. And he's a TV news person, so it's obviously he's a great interviewer. And then the last one I wanted to mention to give a shout out to true crime, like the rest of us, is The Prosecutors. Have you guys listened to The Prosecutors in your true crime travels? It's my favorite true crime podcast because I do like true crime, but I'm a little bit, I don't know, maybe just a little bit squeamish about, you know, violence. So this one is hosted by two prosecuting attorneys, Brett and Alice, and they are also have a great chemistry. They're great friends, and they cover not just the crime, but the details of trial and how the law works. And I just find that really, really fascinating. So you kind of see it from the pretrial and post-trial perspectives, and they give their kind of opinion on what happened. And I think I like true crime because I like the mystery aspect of it more than anything else. I like storytelling and I like the mystery. And this one just hits all those buttons, and I just love the host. So I kind of broke my own rules and shared 3 instead of 1.
Yeah, I mean, we were told 1, and I am actually kind of mad about it now.
I knew it would be hard for Sari. She has so many podcasts. I love true crime. I'm not going to share a true crime one today. My favorite podcast that I've been listening to a lot lately is You're Wrong About. Also, Michael Hobbs is one of the hosts, and the other one is Sarah Marshall. And I love how well researched all of the episodes are. I think it's just such a wealth of information. One of the episodes I think about a lot is the episode that they did on Facebook and the spread of misinformation and news on Facebook. And I think something that's really special about the way they kind of tackle these various topics is that I feel like they do it with a lot of empathy. So it's comes from this not judgy place. It doesn't place the onus on the people consuming the fake news. It's the people putting it out there that we need to do better. And I think that point of view comes across in all of their episodes. I mean, there's episodes on the satanic panic, very varied subject matters, but just such a good podcast.
Yay, Michael Hobbs and Phoebe Judge. Represented well today.
It's even better because we didn't coordinate.
No.
Beyond okay, bring your favorites in these 3 categories. I think that's something interesting about so many sewers that I've met is we're all very different, but a lot of people I meet who have this shared interest also have these other weird overlaps. I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm rotating in the same circle too much.
No, it's a personality type.
I think so, right? It has to be. Well, I feel really excited because I've been reaffirmed that I listen to good things, but also have a couple things that I need to go listen to after this. So we'll be sure to link all of the podcasts that we mentioned today in the show notes so that if you like podcasts other than Seamwork Radio and Love to Sew, you can go listen to those as well.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us today, guys. Where can people find you if they want to follow you?
Oh, thank you for having us. Well, you can visit our podcast website, lovetosewpodcast.com. All our show notes are on there. We also have a Patreon where we release bonus episodes and we talk about our favorites on Patreon all the time. We always mention our new favorite podcasts and recipes and things like that. That's patreon.com/lovetosew. And my business is Blackbird Fabrics, blackbirdfabrics.com.
And my business is Helen's Closet Patterns, helensclosetpatterns.com. And yeah, we look forward to hopefully getting some new listeners. Please come on over and give us a listen. Let us know what you think.
Yeah, definitely listen to Love to Sew if you haven't yet. And Haley and I will see you next week on Seamwork Radio. Bye.
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 Seamwork Radio is brought to you by the team at Seamwork. Seamwork's an online community that supports you in creating a wardrobe that feels right for you. When you join us at Seamwork, you become part of our private community of makers, and you also get access to monthly sew-along classes, a library of over 200 sewing patterns, and tons of great resources to help guide you through the sewing adventure that you choose. Podcast listeners can get half off a Seamwork Unlimited membership, which means you can download as many of those 200 plus patterns as you want at any time, and our community will be there to guide and support you. If you'd like to join us for half off, just visit seamwork.com/go/podcast50. You can also find us on Instagram at Seamwork or visit our YouTube channel, which is called Seamwork Video. We love hearing from you, so let us know if there's a topic or a personal story that you'd like us to cover. Thanks for listening to Seamwork Radio.